The scent of stale cigar smoke and damp concrete hung like a phantom in the subterranean rooms of Whitehall. It was the summer of 1940, but in the heart of London, beneath layers of earth and reinforced steel, the creeping chill of imminent annihilation seeped through the walls. Europe, once a proud mosaic of sprawling empires and ancient republics, had been swallowed by a mechanical darkness. France, the old ally, the supposedly impenetrable continental shield, had crumbled in a matter of weeks. The grand avenues of Paris now echoed with the rhythmic, terrifying thud of Prussian boots marching beneath the Arc de Triomphe, and Britain, encircled by hostile grey waters, suddenly found herself entirely alone. The silence in the war cabinet was not the silence of peace. It was the suffocating quiet of the slaughterhouse waiting for the blade to fall. At the center of this dimly lit room, a man with hunched shoulders and eyes heavy with the burden of centuries stared down at a map spread across a heavy wooden table. Winston Churchill did not merely see lines drawn on parchment. He saw the very arteries through which the lifeblood of his nation flowed. He understood, with a terrifying clarity, that morality is a luxury afforded only to those who are not standing on the precipice of extinction. History, with its ruthless and unforgiving pen, was about to demand a tribute that the human soul could barely endure to pay. Outside these reinforced walls, the world believed the greatest peril came from the darkened skies, swarming with the bombers of the Luftwaffe. But Churchill's true terror did not lie in the clouds over London. It rested on the shimmering waters of the Mediterranean Sea, anchored under the blistering North African sun of Algeria. The French fleet, the fourth largest naval power on the globe. Gigantic dreadnoughts, agile cruisers, stealthy submarines, mountains of weaponized steel that, only yesterday, sailed side by side with the British Royal Navy as brothers in arms. Now, with the French surrender, this colossal armada hung in a perilous, terrifying limbo. The armistice dictated that these French vessels must return to Axis-controlled ports to be disarmed. It was a hollow promise, penned by men who did not know the meaning of the word honor. Churchill knew that if Hitler seized those ships, Britain would starve. The delicate equilibrium of naval power would be shattered instantly. Britain would be isolated, blockaded, and strangled long before the first German soldier ever set foot on the white cliffs of Dover. There was no room for hope in Whitehall. There was no margin to trust the word of a defeated ally, nor the paper promises of a fascist dictator. Survival demanded an act of profound brutality, an action so contrary to the laws of fraternity and civilized warfare that the history books would spend decades trying to justify it, and then, slowly, silently, try to erase it. Thousands of miles away, in the azure waters of the Mers-el-Kébir Bay, the midday heat distorted the horizon into a shimmering mirage. French sailors scrubbed the wooden decks of the mighty battleships Britannia and Dunkirk, their sweat mingling with the salty breeze of the Mediterranean. They were exhausted men, their hearts shattered by the sudden, incomprehensible fall of their homeland. They waited for orders, dreaming of the families they had left behind in cities now occupied by foreign soldiers. Then, looking toward the mouth of the harbor, they saw the familiar, imposing silhouettes of British warships from Force H approaching. The massive 15-inch guns of the HMS who'd cut sharp profiles against the cloudless sky. At first, there was no panic among the French crews. These were their brothers. They had bled together in the mud of Flanders. They had shared the same untamed oceans. But the atmosphere grew heavy and cold when the British vessels did not enter the port in a gesture of peace. Instead, they dropped anchor and formed a blockade, a towering wall of grey steel, sealing off the only exit to the open sea. British Admiral James Somerville, a man of unshakable honor and deep compassion, held a piece of decoded paper that burned his fingers. It was an ultimatum sent directly from Churchill's bunker. The options presented to the French Admiral Mers-el-Kébir were as rigid as the grave. Join the British fleet to continue the fight, sail to distant ports in the Americas, or scuttle your own ships. If Gensal refused, Somerville had strict, unforgiving orders. Somerville's silence on the bridge of his flagship was the sound of a man's soul being ground down by the gears of total war. He had dined with these French officers. He knew their faces, their jokes, their families. Now, he was being ordered to become their executioner. The hours dragged on under the relentless North African sun. Messengers crossed the calm waters in small motorboats, carrying desperate words that could not heal the devastating wound opening between the two navies. Diplomacy was dying with every tick of the clock. French pride, deeply wounded by their recent national defeat, clashed violently against British desperation. Admiral Gensel, feeling cornered and humiliated under the crosshairs of Allied artillery, refused to yield. On the British decks, young gunners, their knuckles white as they gripped the cold metal of their turrets, peered through optical sights. They saw the French sailors, men just like them, boys in the same uniforms running across the decks, preparing for a battle that made no sense. The British sailors prayed, in dry, breathless whispers, for the French admiral to concede. Nobody wanted to fire. Nobody wanted to cross the invisible line from which there was no return. But in London, the clock had no heart. Deep in his bunker, Churchill smoked his cigar in absolute silence, staring into the void. He was absorbing the hatred of future generations to ensure that future generations would exist at all. He was making the monstrous calculation that leadership sometimes requires damnation. The deadline expired. The sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the bay of Mers-el-Kébir in a rusty, peach-colored hue that, within moments, would turn into the color of freshly spilled blood. The first roar tore through the air not just as a sound, but as a physical rupture in the fabric of reality itself. The gigantic British naval guns vomited fire and thick orange smoke, hurling tons of high-explosive steel across the vibrating air. It was not a battle, it was an execution. The massive shells struck the anchored French warships, which were unable to maneuver, trapped like wounded beasts in a cage of stone in shallow water. The mighty battleship Britannia was pierced directly through its armored heart. Its ammunition magazine detonated with a ferocity that made the very ocean boil. A towering column of black smoke and incandescent flames tore through the sky, rising hundreds of feet as reinforced steel twisted, snapped, and melted like wax under a blowtorch. 1,000 men, fathers, sons, and brothers were incinerated or swallowed by the dark, churning waters in a matter of seconds. The once sweet air of the Mediterranean was instantly choked with the acrid stench of cordite, burning crude oil, and roasting flesh. Air raid sirens howled in a maddening mechanical lament, blending with the agonizing screams of those leaping into a sea covered in a blanket of burning fuel. Aboard the HMS Hood, the British sailors reloaded their massive cannons in a funereal, devastating silence. There were no cheers of victory, no triumphant military euphoria. There was only the rhythmic, industrial, and merciless sound of men carrying out an order that would haunt them until the end of their days. Tears streamed down the soot-covered faces of the gunners as they pulled the firing lanyards. With every blinding flash, they betrayed an invisible oath of humanity. The bay transformed into a cauldron of unspeakable destruction. Monumental ships listed heavily, toppling over like wounded titans, bleeding thick, black oil into the once pristine waters. The sun, now completely obscured by a thick, greasy shroud of smoke, cast an apocalyptic twilight glow over the bloodstained sea. This was the terrible price of extreme pragmatism. It was the exact moment when Britain proved to the world and to the Axis powers that she was willing to descend into the absolute depths of hell, willing to stain her own hands with the blood of her closest friends just to avoid subjugation. When the thunder of the guns finally ceased, the silence that followed did not bring relief. It brought only the suffocating horror of realization. Nearly 1,300 French sailors lay dead. Broken bodies floated in a darkened sea. Smoldering wreckage hissed as it cooled against the waves, and the groan of twisting metal sounded like a ghostly, unending mourning. Admiral Somerville, standing frozen on his command bridge, seemed to have aged 10 years in 10 minutes. He had won the engagement, but the victory tasted only of ash and bone. He would later write that this was the greatest political blunder and the most terrible tragedy he had ever been forced to execute. The sea does not forgive the sins of men, it merely swallows them whole. And on that fateful day, Mers-el-Kébir became a graveyard, not of bitter enemies, but of sacrificed allies. Days later, in the grand historic halls of London, Winston Churchill stood before the House of Commons. The air in the chamber was incredibly heavy, charged with a mixture of dreadful anticipation and suppressed revulsion. He did not hide what he had done. He did not sugarcoat the sheer brutality of his order. With a voice choked by heavy emotion, he recounted the attack, taking upon his own shoulders the full, crushing responsibility for the spilling of innocent Allied blood. And then, for the first time since the nightmare of the war had begun, the British Parliament roared. They did not roar in celebration of death, but in a terrifying, unified recognition of the ironclad resolve of the man leading them. The entire world heard that macabre message. Across the Atlantic, President Franklin D. Roosevelt understood immediately the British were never going to surrender. They would fight like cornered wolves, tearing at the throats of their own if it meant survival. History loves to paint war in distinct, easily digestible tones of brilliant light and absolute darkness, of noble heroes and evil villains. But in the deep, freezing shadows of human conflict, virtue often demands to be bathed in sin. The attack on Mers-el-Kébir was quietly swept under the rug of the glorious, romanticized narrative of the Second World War. It remains a deeply uncomfortable chapter, a grim, haunting reminder that in the ultimate game of annihilation, there is no such thing as clean hands. There are only those who survive to write the history books, and those who sink into the cold silence of oblivion. Today, the sea off the coast of Algeria is placid once more. The warm Mediterranean wind blows over calm waters that hold no grudges and tell no tales. But in the dark, silent depths, buried beneath the silt and the fading memories of a broken generation, the rusted steel skeletons of a betrayed fleet remain. They stand as a quiet, eternal monument to the most lethal order a leader ever gave. They are a testament to the unspeakable, ruthless, and tragically human cost of remaining standing when the rest of the civilized world has already fallen.